Hey friends, happy Thursday. Chef Kris here. I am so excited to bring you guys another Cook with Kris. Today is all about seasoning your food. And before you click away, this is a skill that I can guarantee most of you who are not professional cooks probably don't get 100% right. In fact, I don't get it 100% right all the time, and I take steps and skip around and don't do some of these principles, but when you do, I can guarantee that salting right is going to make your food taste so much better. And I am all about helping you to create more delicious everyday meals. I do have professional chef training and I worked in the culinary industry for a number of years, but I'm a mom and a business owner and I need to make quick meals, but I want them to be delicious and I want them to be satisfying. And I'm on a mission to create more confident cooks who love cooking and who love food as much as I do. I don't want you to feel like cooking is hard, and I don't want you to feel like cooking well is hard. So just having some of these little tips and tricks in order to learn how to season your food really well is going to make a huge difference in how your food tastes. So today we're going to get really nerdy today, okay? We're going to talk about salt, we're going to talk about seasoning well, and I'm also going to make some carne asada steak bowls. So I'm going to kind of cook as I talk to you guys about salt, about seasoning, and feel free to ask me questions as I go. I'll do my best to check them as I talk, but I will be cooking, so if I don't see it right away, just hang on, and I will answer it in just a little bit. So I'm gonna start for my carne asada steak bowls. I actually have some delicious flank steak right here that is marinating. So I'll put this in my stories after, because this is a recipe that's actually not going up on the blog for probably a month or two, so it's going to be a little while before it officially goes on the blog. But my carne asada steak marinade is super simple. It's the juice of 2 limes, so try and get juicy lime. So in order to tell if it's a juicy lime, just if you can squeeze it, this one is actually not super juicy. You can also roll it to get a little bit more of the juice out, but if it's a dry lime, it's a dry lime. I'm sorry. You want 2 nice and juicy limes. You want the juice of 1 large navel orange. I don't have that to show you because I used it. Couple tablespoons of avocado oil, about a half teaspoon of salt, which we'll talk about in a second, and we'll talk about why I put salt in my marinade. What else is in there? About a half teaspoon of cumin. I have about half a jalapeno chopped up. If you don't want any spice, then you can leave it out, but it does add a little bit of spice, and because we're not actually cooking it in the marinade, we're just marinating it. It's not super spicy. It just adds a little bit of spice, a little bit of heat if you were here for our flavor conversation last week, and a couple tablespoons of chopped fresh cilantro. If you're not a cilantro fan, we can't be friends. No, I'm just kidding. My sister doesn't like cilantro either, and I don't get it, but she's actually eating with me tonight and she gets this, and I promise you that she will like it. It's not too cilantro-y, but if you want to leave it out, you're welcome to as well. The key here is the citrus and the salt, which is going to add a ton of flavor to this flank steak. So this has been marinating for about 3 hours, and that's typically, I've got my hot plate over here. Hold on, let's not burn the house down. So typically I recommend marinating at least 2 to 3 hours ahead of time, especially when it's a larger piece of meat. This is about 1.5 pounds of flank steak. It's not a huge piece of flank steak, but I recommend, and we'll talk about that in just a second why, but at least 2 to 3 hours in advance, but overnight is even better. And we'll talk about that. So I've got my flank steak, and that is just resting right now. So it was just in a pretty cold environment in my freezer bag, so I'm just gonna go ahead and let it rest for a little bit at room temperature for about 10 minutes or so. I want it to come to room temperature before I go ahead and cook it. So I've got that sitting there hanging out, and for the base of my bowl, I'm going to create a really delicious and easy cilantro lime rice. Now, okay, so like friends who are not fans of cilantro, I'm sorry right now, but I love this rice, okay? And it's so easy. If you've ever had the cilantro lime rice from, whoop, I can't move that. It's plugged in. If you've ever had the cilantro lime rice from Chipotle, this is very similar. So I've got my big jar of rice here. This is pre-washed rice. Otherwise, wash your rice. That's not what I'm looking for. I'll use that in a second. You guys, batting 1,000 today. So I'm going to just put my rice in the rice cooker over here. I get asked a lot, what is my secret for perfectly cooked grains? It's a rice cooker. Some people like using the Instant Pot for grains. It's okay, but I really like a rice cooker. And I use a rice cooker for rice. I use it for quinoa. I use it for millet. I use it for pretty much anything. You just want to make sure that you get the ratios right. So I'm just going to go ahead and put water in here. So for white rice, the ratio is 2 to 1. So you want 2 cups of water to 1 cup of rice. Rinse it if it's not rinsed. And I'm gonna go ahead and add that in there and just go ahead and I'm gonna turn it on while I get my lime ready. So you can use as much lime as you want. I already have half a lime here left over from last night's dinner. So I'm just gonna squeeze in half a lime. I like about half of a lime's worth, half of a juicy lime. Whoops, I'm getting some on my pan. I like about a half of a lime for every cup of rice. And because you can always add a little bit more lime at the end. So let's talk about citrus for a second here. I know we're talking about salt, but acid does a couple things to our food. Acid has been called like the great balancer when it comes to food. It balances out saltiness. So if you have a dish that's a little bit salty, it balances it out. I'm gonna chop up some cilantro here, about a 1/4 cup. Did you know you can eat the cilantro stems? You can. Most people just use the leaves. I've got a couple yellow leaves here because the cilantro it's been sitting in my fridge. The way I like to store it is like flowers with water in the bottom in a mason jar. And it works really well and keeps it really good, but we're at the end of that right now. So acid balances out salt. It also balances out sweet. We talked about flavors last week, but it also helps to break down meat. You might notice that if you add acid and you don't let it sit and actually take the time to break down the meat, it makes it a little bit tough. If you give it enough time, it will make your meat delicious. And the same thing with salt. So I like adding a little bit of lime. Oh, so the other thing I was gonna say is lime or a lemon, or really any citrus acids, also act as a form of seasoning. So I'm adding about I'm gonna do it right now. You can add it ahead of time. It won't be as bright green and delicious, but I like the flavor within the rice. You can also add it right at the end. So totally up to you, but I'm just keeping it simple over here. So salt is very much like acid when it comes to meat especially. So if we're getting sciencey over here, salt is a mineral. And there are 2 reactions that happen within salt and whatever you're putting it on: diffusion and osmosis. So osmosis is when the salt is moving from the less salty part of whatever it is. The more salty part to the less salty part. It's from moving from the more salty part to the less salty part. So imagine you are cooking vegetables in a pot of water, okay? Always, whatever you're cooking in water, you always want to salt the water really, really well, because not all of that salt is going to get into the vegetables, especially if it's not going to be cooking for that long. Like if you're blanching your vegetables, you're only cooking them for a couple minutes. That's not a lot of time for the salt to actually move from the salt water into the vegetables. But there needs to be more salt in order to actually salt those vegetables. Does that make sense? Same thing with pasta. Pasta isn't in the water for that long, and it's the only time you are actually seasoning that pasta itself. Yes, you're gonna put a sauce on top, but that sauce on top isn't necessarily going to have the time to salt the pasta itself. You're probably tossing it just before serving. So that pasta underneath that sauce is gonna be super bland if you don't salt the water. Most people undersalt their water when they're cooking vegetables or when they're cooking pasta. You want like a handful of salt. Not even kidding. That's why I keep salt in a container like this. You want a handful of salt when you're cooking anything in water because of the act of osmosis. The salt water is salty, and so what's going to happen is the salt is a mineral, and everything in the world wants balance, right? So the mineral content is going to try to balance from one side to the other. So the salt is going to start to move into the vegetables or into the pasta, and that takes some time. And if there's less time, you'll want more salt so that process actually happens. So your pasta actually gets seasoned. So your vegetables actually get seasoned. With meat is a little bit different, okay? So salt actually acts to break down the proteins in meat, but it takes time. So I told you, osmosis is moving from the salty side to the less salty side. There's also the process of diffusion that happens with minerals. And so that takes time. So any piece of meat that you're gonna cook, we're not talking about seafood. We'll talk about that for a second, but any sort of meat that you're gonna cook, the longer ahead you can salt it, the better, because it's going to take time for that salt to diffuse in the meat and actually season in the meat. And this even goes for things that you're going to slow cook. Yes, there is going to be a sauce typically when you're going to slow cook something, and so some of that, especially if you're using like a salted broth or something like that, that will sink into the meat, so you want to be mindful of that. You don't need to over salt your meat if you're using a salted broth when you put that in the slow cooker or something that's going to, or braising it or something like that, because we don't want to oversalt our food. But most people don't oversalt their food. Most people undersalt their food or salt their food at the wrong time. We'll talk about timing in just a second. We're kind of talking about the before, and then we'll talk about the during. But you want to salt your meat ahead of time. So you want to make sure that there is time for that meat to actually season beyond just the top layer. If you've ever had like a chicken breast, for instance, and the skin is like super crispy and delicious, it's roasted, and then you slice into it and you take a bite and you're like, this tastes a little bit like plain rubber. That's because it's probably not salted all the way through. The point of salt is to season our food and to enhance the flavor of our food. So we don't want our food to taste salty. Oftentimes our food tastes salty because we're adding salt at the end and it's just on the top layer. And then we're barraged with this like salt flavor. And we're like, that's too salty. And then the next bite we take is super bland. So we want our food to be well seasoned. So that means we want to salt in advance for pretty much anything. So when I say salt in advance, I mentioned the example of vegetables or pasta water. That is salting in advance. You don't need to salt your pasta before you put it in the pot, and you don't need to salt your green beans before you put them in the water. You're doing that by salting the water. Now, with items that are going to be roasted or sauteed, vegetables specifically, you just want to salt right before because it will start to draw some of the moisture out of them. But you still want to salt ahead. Meat, you want to allow the salt and then any sort of marinade you're using to start to break down the protein a little bit. That is what is going to provide a juicier meat, a juicier steak. So your chicken breast, for instance, okay, you bring it home from the market, salt it. So take it out of the package, pat it dry to start, salt it really well, cover it, put it back in the fridge. It'll be ready to go whenever you want to cook it. So you want to cover it and seal it if it's going to be a couple days, but yes, it'll be fine. You just want to cover it and seal it, but you want to salt it ahead of time. That is going to produce your most delicious meat. And the same thing, you always want to salt ahead whenever you are cooking any sort of vegetables as well. That is going to create the most delicious vegetable, the most delicious meat, because it is seasoned throughout. Now, a marinade works very similar to that, and oftentimes a marinade is the only time where I see people actually seasoning whatever they're cooking really well. So they are taking the time to create a marinade and they're sticking it in the fridge. This is something that I love to do when I do my meal prep, and I actually haven't done it in a while because I love to marinate things that I'm gonna grill, but you can marinate anything you want. And there's so many easy marinades out there. I have a few that are coming to the blog in the next couple of months because I wanna encourage you to season your food really well, and they're really easy and you can keep them in the fridge, or you can just whip them up really quick, but they're gonna change the flavor of your food because seasoning really happens from the inside out. And if you never get that or flavor happens from the inside out. And if you never get that flavor on the inside, then your food is gonna taste flat. Food that is not very well seasoned tastes flat. And you want your food to be vibrant and to taste really good. I'm gonna turn on my heat over here again. and to be well seasoned. We don't want our food to taste salty. We want it to be well salted. So I'm turning up the heat over here. I'm about to go ahead and grill this flank steak because I want to create this beautiful bowl for you guys. So it's a carne asada. If you're just hopping on, I'm going to share in my stories later my quick carne asada marinade because it's going to be a couple months before it's up on the blog. I can't tell you exactly when, but you'll be able to have that and screenshot that. It's super, super easy. Orange, lime, jalapeno, cilantro, cumin, salt, and it's been marinating for about 3 hours. I'm gonna go ahead and cook that on I've got my pan over here, my grill pan, because there's snow outside. It's cold. I'm not grilling outside today. But I made sure to season it ahead of time and I know it's gonna have really delicious flavor. The longer you can season ahead of time, the better, the more delicious, the more time that it will break down the proteins of meat especially. Now, seafood. It will turn seafood tough because it doesn't have time to break it down. So you want to season right before. So season any of your seafood just before you're about to cook it. You don't want it to get tough, so we don't need to season it well in advance. Seafood is good. And the other thing I want to mention is to season as you go. So one thing that I see most home chefs forget to do or don't even know to do is to taste as you go, even if you're following a recipe, because each one of us has a different palate and a different preference. And when something says salt to taste, it literally means salt until it tastes good to you. But food tastes flat, going back to that again, when the salt is on top instead of when the salt is layered. So I want to encourage you to salt ahead and then layer as you go. So taste a little bit of the food you're making as you're cooking it. Now, if you are cooking something that you can't taste ahead, like burger meat or meatballs or something like that, take a little piece of it off. It takes a minute to cook it in a pan and just taste it. Make sure it tastes good before you make a giant batch and then your kids don't eat it or smother it with 16 pounds of ketchup because they're like, this doesn't taste like anything. Try it out, okay? When you're talking about really big pieces of meat, you want way more salt than you think you do. So I know I'm getting a little off track, but I want to make sure that I mention this. You want way more salt than you think you do for something like a brisket. You want about a teaspoon of kosher salt per pound, okay? So there's only a half teaspoon of salt. Like I mentioned, acid does season a little bit itself, and I'm also gonna season this before I put it in the pan, and this is 1.5 pounds of flank steak. But if I was going to cook this, if it was a lot thicker, right, and if I was gonna cook this for a long time and I want that seasoning to really absorb, to diffuse into the meat, then I want to salt this ahead of time, probably a day ahead. So make sure you're salting ahead, and then make sure you are salting as you're cooking. So you are tasting as you go and you're layering those flavors. So there are foods that impart a salty flavor or a briny flavor to them. Things like cheeses, especially things like Parmesan and Asiago. Olives are briny. Sardines and anchovies are briny. What else is briny? Soy sauce is salty. So anything that you're adding to it that might be adding some salt, you want to make sure that you are tasting it as you go, especially when you add those items, so you're not over salting it. But you want to make sure that you have those layers of seasoning throughout, because if you're just trying to throw it on at the end, it's just going to taste like salt on the top. It's not going to taste well seasoned throughout. So if you take anything from this, taste as you go, salt as you go, salt ahead, salt during. And this doesn't mean that you are using a ton of salt. You need more salt than you think when you're talking about like a really big piece of meat. Not all of that salt is going to be in your piece of meat. It's just seasoning the whole meat really well so that it tastes really good throughout. And the same thing, when you are putting a handful of salt into the pasta water or a handful of salt into the water that you're using if you're blanching vegetables, you are not adding like 1,000,000 grams of sodium to the little bit that you are going to eat. I know a lot of people are afraid of salt. You don't need to be afraid of salt. I also love using a salt that is more than just sodium. We'll talk about types of salt in just a minute, but I love real salt, and this is not an ad for real salt. I just like it. I've been using it for years. It's a sea salt, but it has a full spectrum of minerals because it's not bleached, and so it's more than just sodium, okay? So it actually has some nutrient benefits to it. Kosher salt is kind of like the standard. This is Baleen. A lot of chefs like the Diamond brand, but I find this fine. Kosher salt is kind of like the standard for most chefs. And the reason being that the grains don't necessarily stick together. They're big enough that it's really easy. Okay, so I might as well go ahead and salt this, huh? Okay, I'll show you guys in just a second the salting technique. But it's big enough that you can salt it and you can spread it out. Whenever you salt something, you want to make sure that you are salting from above so it's salted evenly. So you don't have like a clump of salt here and a clump of salt there. Obviously, if you're going to add it to something that you're cooking on the stove and stir it around, that's different. But if you're salting a piece of meat, then you want to make sure you're doing it from above. So let me go ahead and take this out of the marinade. I'm pretty hot over here. I'm just going to go ahead and grab that. I'm going to take this out of the marinade and I'm going to show you how I go ahead and actually give this a little bit of a salting before I go ahead and put it on the grill. So the rest of my carne asada steak bowl, so we have our cilantro lime rice. Like I said, you can add I like adding the lime ahead of time. You can add the cilantro and the lime ahead of time if you want to. Adding the cilantro at the end is really good as well. It will be more vibrant that way, but it will be more cilantro-y if you do it ahead of time. I don't think cilantro-y is a word, but I made it one. So I'm just taking off, I know for those of you who don't love meat, I'm just taking off some of this marinade so there's not a whole ton of jalapenos on there. I know it's not all that pretty. I also don't want it to be super moist to put on the pan because I don't want it to be too crazy. And I am going to toss the marinade. Food safety, right? All right, and the reason why the meat is gray now, it was bright red and fresh. I bought it yesterday. When I put it in the marinade is because of the acid. The acid is starting to break it down. That's a good thing. We want really tender meat, especially flank and skirt steak, because they do tend to be a little bit more tough because they're leaner than some other steaks. Always wash your hands when you are handling meat. Let's talk about how to salt, okay? So I talked about a couple of the different types of salt. Let's talk about actually how to salt. You want to salt from above, okay? And especially if you are using something where it really needs to be evenly salted. So I typically, my standard is real salt. If you are using a recipe, and if you're following a recipe and you are using like an iodized salt, it might be too salty. So salt as you go, adjust as you go. Oftentimes they will give you the smallest amount, assuming that you're gonna use like an iodized salt. And if you don't, if you're using something that's less rich in sodium, yes, salts can be less rich in sodium. Or if it's a denser salt, like your kosher salt, you might need a little bit more salt, and that's okay. You're not over salting your food if it tastes good to you. Okay, so you want to salt. There's a couple different ways to salt. If you're salting, like I said, pasta water or water for vegetables, like it's literally a handful. For a piece of meat like this, you want to salt from above, okay? And I use just a little pinching, okay? So we're going throughout and you don't want to go all around. You want to go from one side to the other, and you pinch. You do it nice and up above. This has already been seasoned, right? So I'm not doing a whole ton only because it has been marinated, but I would put more on if it wasn't, because again, this isn't your one piece that you are seasoning. This is the whole piece of meat. And I have my grill pan like fired up over here, you guys. It's looking good. Okay, ready? It's gonna sizzle. So flank steak, it's pretty lean, and it does do best when it's like medium rare to rare. So I'm gonna cook it for about 5-ish minutes per side. You always wanna make sure your meat stays at room temperature for at least like 10 to 20 minutes before. Now, by the way, I mentioned as far ahead as you can seasoning your meat. So it's marinating it at least 2 to 3 hours ahead of time, or that's the day before, salting it and putting it back in the fridge, yes. And then you want to pat it dry because of that osmosis, right? There is going to be some of the water from the meat is going to come out. That doesn't mean your meat is turning dry. It means the salt is actually absorbing throughout the meat. You want to pat it dry. before you cook it, just as a side note, so you don't have like a ton of splatters. The day before is great. Marinade the day before to a few hours before is great, but if you haven't done that, at least those 10 to 20 minutes before, take it out of the package, okay, pat it dry, add the salt to the top, use that pinching technique, salt it really well, let it sit for 10 to 20 minutes until it comes to room temperature. Once it's close to room temperature, you don't need to like put the meat thermometer in there yet. I mean, you can use a meat thermometer after if you want to. And I highly recommend it if you're doing something like poultry. Steak, it's mostly preference. But, you know, poultry and pork, you want to make sure you're using that meat thermometer. Ground meat too. So you want to make sure that you give it a little bit of time. You give it a good amount of time in the pan, and then remember that it's also going to rest after, and it will continue to cook, sometimes up to 5 degrees, sometimes even 10 degrees if it's a big bird, after it comes out of the oven. But you plan for that instead of taking it off super early. You want to take it off when you should take it off, depending on the doneness that you want. So I've got my steak going over here. I've got my cilantro lime rice going over here. I've also got some peppers over here that I'm gonna go ahead and saute up in a pan behind me. And because I'm cooking the peppers ahead of time, so I already meal prepped my peppers. Sorry, I'm not seasoning them ahead of time. I'm gonna season them when I put them in the pan. I'm gonna season over the top and I'm gonna toss them, okay? We wanna make sure that that seasoning is well spread throughout, and it will start to season it as you go. So let's talk about seasoning. So, I mean, I guess like the cardinal rule of salting is salt before, salt during, don't just salt at the end. And please, if you are someone, Dad, I'm watching you, who just salts your food as soon as it gets to the table and you're like, oh, this is gonna need salt. Please wait a second and try the food before you salt it, or else you might risk over salting it. Remember that layered salt is much more flavorful. Salt on top is just gonna be salty, and it's not gonna have that really deep flavor throughout. You wanna season your food, not salt it. So yes, there's always a time and a place to add salt to the top, but you wanna work on seasoning throughout so you don't need to add salt to the top. That's why we're salting throughout. So, and I also wanna talk about just seasonings in general. So seasonings that can use the richness of toasting. So we're talking any sort of curry powder, like cardamom, cumin, any of those like Indian type spices, and they do amazing curries, things like that. They do amazing with just 10 seconds of toasting in the pan. So if you have some oil in the pan, maybe you have some onions, some garlic, some ginger, whatever you've got in the pan, adding the spices to the pan and toasting it for just 10 seconds is gonna bring out the aromatic compounds of those spices and really elevate the flavor of your dish. So that's something that if it's available for you, don't skip that. A lot of recipes will tell you to toast the spices while you're cooking, and a lot of people just dump it all in together. Try toasting your spices and notice the difference in flavor. Notice the difference in the richness of flavor. It really does make a difference. I'm gonna grab my tongs. When it's coming to things like dried herbs, what are you looking at? Okay, we're at about 5 minutes. I'm gonna go ahead and take my flank steak over here, and I'm just going to, you can see it, to get the grill marks, all you do, like the crisscross ones, is turn it sideways. So we're doing that, and then I'm gonna flip it. Good. So when it comes to dried herbs, you want to add them at the beginning as much as possible, because they need time to break down and they need time for those aromatic compounds to release, for the flavors to actually meld into whatever you're cooking. If you are adding dried oregano to the end of your soup, it's probably gonna taste like dried oregano. It is not gonna have that like delicious Italian oregano taste. Drives me insane. Okay, if I go to a restaurant and they put dried anything on top of the dish, I try not to judge, but I might have some thoughts. It's probably the young cook who does not know yet. Please don't put dried herbs on top of your food. Give it time. Give them time to break down. Give them time to actually rehydrate. Remember, they're dried, right? And imagine just eating some dried herbs. They're not very delicious. Herbs are delicious. Dried herbs, not so delicious. So give it time to break down. give it time to flavor your food, okay? Just like you're giving your salt time to season your food. All right, we're gonna flip this baby on over. Looking good. All right. You wanna give your herbs, your dried herbs especially, time. So if you don't have fresh herbs, now there are some instances where like the dried herbs are just not gonna cut it. So things like fresh dressings, you can get away with it in a marinade if it's gonna marinate for a while, but again, you wanna make sure the best thing you can do, actually, if you are gonna create a marinade with dried herbs and because you don't have fresh herbs, is to actually marinate the marinade for a little bit. So let it sit in whatever, acid or oils or whatever. So but when I say acid, I mean like citrus or vinegar, whatever. You want to actually give it some time in there before you actually put it on whatever you're marinating. And as I'm saying that, I realized I forgot the splash of apple cider vinegar that I normally like to put in my marinade. So we're gonna see how it is. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be delicious. For those of you who are just hopping on, it's a carne asada is what I'm cooking right now. I'm making carne asada bowls for dinner tonight. They are gonna be delicious. I'm at home grilling on the grill pan over here. It's been marinated ahead of time, and we are talking about salt. You can also make these same bowls with black beans. If you prefer a plant-based version, everything else is plant-based. I'm gonna do the carne asada on top of the cilantro lime rice with some sauteed peppers, some sliced avocado, some fresh lime, and cilantro on the side. It's gonna be really, really tasty and super simple. Oh, and yeah, I said the rice. It'll be really good. It'd also be really good with some cotija cheese on top. Really good, but I don't have any, so we're making do with what we've got. But it brings in all of those different elements of flavor that we talked about last week, right? So we talked about how we've got some heat from the jalapenos and the carne asada, and we've got some lime juice that's going to help to balance that out. The cilantro or lime rice is a little bit cooler. That is gonna balance it all out. You've got some of the sweetness in the marinade that will balance out a little bit of the sour in the marinade, and it'll also balance out some of the heat in the marinade. And then of course we've got our salt, because to bring everything together and to make our food really, really delicious, we need to know how to season well. We need to know how to salt our food well, and we need to know when to add our seasonings. So toast your spices if the recipe calls for it. You wanna make sure that you are adding your dried herbs ahead of time. I mentioned there are some instances where dried herbs just don't cut it, but in a recipe, like a recipe that you're cooking on the stovetop, just add your dried herbs. If you want to use dried instead of fresh, add them a little bit ahead of time, and make sure that you are using less than you would the dried, usually about a third. So if it calls for a tablespoon of fresh, it's usually a teaspoon of dried. So that's a good rule of thumb, if that helps you with that. So I'm just gonna keep on cooking over here for a couple minutes. I think the steak's gonna take a little bit longer. I'm not sure if I'm gonna really have the steak ready for you guys, but you guys can hop over to my stories after, and I will share with you the final product. I'll share with you a screenshot of the marinade, and I'll let you guys know how it is. I loved sharing with you guys some of the basics and beyond of cooking in our Confident Cooking series in January. Next month, we are going beyond the basics, and my focus over the next 4 weeks in teaching you guys in Cook with Kris, we're going back to doing full recipes again. In this series, I've done kind of like bits and pieces of recipes and really just taught you the basics of cooking and how to become a better cook. But next week, I am going to really, truly, I can tell my meat it still needs some time, but it's getting there. I'm gonna teach you guys how to make your food taste even more delicious by teaching you guys 4 different sauces over the month of February that are going to make your meals so much more delicious. These are versatile sauces that you can use in several different recipes, and I'm gonna share a recipe with you each week. So you'll get that sauce recipe each week when you join me here at 2 o'clock Eastern. You're always welcome to ask me your questions. You are welcome to send me suggestions too. I've had some really awesome suggestions from you guys. I'm going to be sharing with you guys some more tips and tricks about how to elevate the basics that you might always be making the same type of rice or the same type of vegetables, And I'm gonna give you some suggestions on how to mix that up and just make your food more delicious. So we'll talk about that too, but the primary focus is going to be going beyond the basics, getting you some really delicious sauces that are just gonna make your meals so much more delicious. So we're gonna talk about that in February. I can't believe we're already at the end of January. This has been so much fun teaching you guys. Expect more videos like this from me on YouTube. We've got lots more to come when it comes to teaching you guys how to be more confident cooks. It brings me so much joy, and I hope that you guys are using these tips and you are enjoying cooking in your kitchen more. All right, looking at my time, looking like this steak is gonna need a little bit more over here. I flipped it once and I was like, no, that's not the right side for it. So we're gonna let it chill for a little while over here. I'll share the final product with you guys over on Instagram stories, and I will see you guys next week for next week's Cook with Kris. We're starting to talk all about sauces. All right, friends, have a beautiful rest of your Thursday, and I'll see you guys next week.